Under the soft glow of an autumn sun in 1998, 10-year-old Matthew Clark pedaled his red Schwinn down Willow Lane, waving to neighbors as he always did, his backpack bouncing lightly against his shoulders. He was supposed to visit a friend just 3 houses down, but he never arrived. By dinner time, the first worry set in. By nightfall, that worry had turned into a full-scale search. Volunteers combed the woods. Dogs followed scent trails that went nowhere. Helicopters swept the skies with searchlights that illuminated only silence. The last person confirmed to have seen him was Eldon Hart, the local handyman, a quiet man who often helped with odd jobs and was said to keep to himself. He told police Matthew had asked him about fixing a squeaky bike chain and then rode off. There were no signs of a struggle, no clues left behind, just an abandoned bike leaning against a tree, its front wheel still spinning when it was found. The police plastered his face across every telephone pole and news broadcast, and for weeks, the entire town of Ashridge moved like it was underwater, slowed by fear, dragged down by confusion. Candlelight vigils turned into silent Sundays. The case eventually faded from headlines, and the Clark family was left with nothing but a locked bedroom and fading Polaroids. As seasons turned, new kids moved into the neighborhood, and the memory of Matthew's smile became something only the oldest residents could recall clearly. Eldon Hart remained in his modest home, unbothered by suspicion that never quite stuck. Time did what it always does, moved on. But for Claire Clark, Matthew's mother, the air never felt right again. She couldn't leave the porch light off, couldn't stop setting an extra place at Thanksgiving. Her son had vanished into thin air, and though the world labeled the case cold, her grief never cooled. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. The Clark house stood frozen in time, a modest 2-story nestled behind a chain-link fence where the porch light never went out, not for a single night in over 2 decades. Inside, Claire Clark moved like a ghost, keeping her son's bedroom exactly as he left it. Dinosaur posters on the wall, a half-finished comic book on the nightstand, a baseball glove still holding the shape of his small hand. She'd vacuum the carpet weekly, talk to him softly while folding laundry, and place fresh flowers in a chipped mug by the window, her stubborn way of denying the years their right to erase. Neighbors had long stopped bringing casseroles. Even the local paper had quit running anniversary pieces, tired of repeating the same unanswered questions. But Claire never surrendered to the silence. She kept calling tip lines, writing letters, staring at children in public places a second too long. Just 3 blocks away, Eldon Hart lived in near total obscurity. His shutters always drawn, lawn mowed like clockwork, never a visitor, never a sound louder than the hum of his porch fan. To most, he was just a harmless recluse, a man whose presence was as faint as dust on an attic beam. But Claire watched him. From behind her curtains, she noted the flickers of light in his attic, the rare movements in his backyard, the way he seemed to vanish when others drew near. She knew, deep down, something wasn't right. And yet, without proof, suspicion rotted quietly, beneath her skin, beneath the floorboards of a town that had learned to live with not knowing. Children grew up, new families moved in, Halloween decorations returned to the street. But for Claire, the world had split the day Matthew disappeared, and no one, not even time, could stitch it back together. The Hart house had long been the one neighbors pointed at, with lowered voices and uneasy glances, its curtains always shut, its paint sun-bleached and flaking like old skin. When Eldon Hart died quietly in the winter of 2023, no one mourned. Just a few town officials who signed off on paperwork and one distant niece who sold the property almost instantly. The new owners, a young couple with 2 kids and no idea of the home's heavy legacy, moved in full of optimism and renovation plans. It didn't take long before things felt off. A persistent sag in the living room floor kept returning, no matter how many times they adjusted it. Finally, a contractor was brought in, a man used to seeing odd things in old houses. But even he paused when his hammer struck hollow beneath the floorboards. When they pried back the wood and insulation, expecting maybe a rotted joist or animal nest, what they found was something else entirely. Something that made the air in the room feel heavier, thicker, like it had been holding its breath for decades. A small cavity, crudely sealed, filled with a foul, sour stench that had no place in a family home. The contractor backed away, white as drywall dust, and told the couple to call the police immediately. Whatever was buried beneath that floor hadn't been meant to be found. As the first squad car arrived and crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, old neighbors peeked through blinds they hadn't touched in years. Whispers reignited like dry brush and wind. The house that had once gone quiet was now screaming. And somewhere, just 3 blocks away, Claire Clark sat on her porch beneath the same porch light she'd left on for 25 years, unaware that the silence she'd lived with for so long was about to crack open. The moment the plywood was lifted and the rancid smell met daylight, everything changed. Beneath the insulation, soaked and yellowed with time, lay the fragile truth, a scattering of small, brittle bones tucked in the corner like a forgotten secret. A tattered shirt sleeve still clung to one arm bone, its fabric faded but unmistakably child-sized. Near the pelvis, nestled in dust and rot, sat a tiny, shattered toy car, red with one missing wheel, just like the one Matthew Clark always carried in his back pocket. The contractor staggered back, nearly dropping his flashlight, and dialed the police with shaking fingers. Within hours, the quiet suburban street was flooded with uniforms, evidence markers, and news vans that hadn't rolled through Ashridge in years. The home was taped off like a crime scene, frozen in amber. The living room now a grave. Forensics moved carefully, speaking in clipped tones, but it didn't take long. Dental records, growth plate analysis, and the personal effects left no room for doubt. It was Matthew. The boy who had vanished without a trace had never left the neighborhood, never left that house. 25 years of theories, flyers, sleepless nights, and porch lights were all answered in the musty crawl space beneath the floorboards of a man no one had dared confront. When Claire Clark received the call, she didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat in the kitchen, staring at the same clock that had ticked through decades of hope, as if waiting for her grief to catch up. When it did, it came like a tidal wave, silent, merciless, and filled with every second she'd spent imagining her son cold, alone, and calling for her in the dark. The town, once numbed by time, suddenly felt the full weight of its failure. What was hidden had finally been found, but at a cost that no one could ever measure. The reopening of Matthew Clark's case cracked open the long-sealed ledger of Eldon Hart's quiet life, and what had once looked like harmless eccentricity began to reek of something far darker. Though he had no criminal record, no arrests, no charges, investigators digging into old neighborhood files and whisper-thin school reports found something far more sinister, a pattern of unease that had been ignored for decades. There were scattered remarks in dusty school counselor logs from kids who mentioned the man with the red truck that made them feel weird, or how Hart would offer them candy or ask if they needed help with their bikes. Harmless, people had thought, just an old handyman being friendly. But suddenly, the puzzle pieces aligned in a way no one could ignore. One former neighbor, now grown, came forward to say she remembered seeing Matthew walk his bike into Hart's yard the day he disappeared. She hadn't thought much of it then, just a blur of childhood memory, but now it clawed its way into focus like a nightmare revisited. Others admitted to small, unsettling encounters they had brushed off. Hart standing too close, lingering stares, questions that didn't seem appropriate. It was all circumstantial, but it painted a picture of a man who had lived in plain sight while hiding something monstrous under his feet. The community was left grappling with guilt, wondering how many red flags they had dismissed out of politeness, how many warnings they had silenced with the word harmless. Eldon Hart had built his life around being invisible. No wife, no children, no guests, just a lawn mowed with precision and a front door that never opened wider than it had to. But in that calculated quiet, he had carried out something unthinkable. The town began to look at its history differently, suddenly seeing shadows in places they used to feel safe. And for Claire Clark, every neighbor's memory became another wound, proof that her son had never stood a chance and that the truth had always been close enough to reach, if only someone had dared to look. When the call finally came, Claire Clark was folding laundry, one of those rituals that had kept her grounded through the years, an act of pretending life was still moving forward. But the words from the officer on the other end of the line stopped time. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply placed the phone back on its cradle, stared at the half-folded shirt in her lap, and felt the bottom of her world quietly give way. Matthew had been under that floor, just blocks from where she stood vigil every night, porch light burning like a prayer no one answered. The realization that she had walked past that house, that she had looked those neighbors in the eye, begged them to remember, to notice, and that all along her son had been buried beneath wood and dust and silence, was a cruelty her mind could barely hold. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. The sharp edges of grief she had learned to carry suddenly became unbearable blades. People left flowers at her gate. Children who had once seen her as the sad lady on the corner now whispered her name with reverence. The whole town wept, but their tears were too late. Church bells rang for Matthew, but Claire heard only the echo of the bicycle that never came home. Reporters knocked. Letters poured in. Old friends sent casseroles and condolences, but nothing filled the crater left by the knowledge that her child had died alone, in the dark, within shouting distance of her love. Claire had rehearsed this moment in dreams and nightmares, imagined every possible ending, but not this. Not so close, not underfoot. She sat on the porch with the light still burning, wrapped in a silence so thick it felt like drowning. And while the town tried to wrap itself around her pain, Claire slipped somewhere deeper into a grief that didn't make noise anymore, only shadows. The digging didn't stop at bones. As forensic crews dismantled the floor of Eldon Hart's home, layer by layer, they uncovered something even more disturbing, a makeshift trapdoor expertly camouflaged beneath a patch of warped linoleum. Below it, a narrow staircase descended into a low, soundproofed crawl space no bigger than a walk-in closet. The air down there was still and heavy, thick with mold and memory. Inside, investigators found a threadbare child's blanket folded on a stained cot, rusted shackles bolted to the walls, and food wrappers so old their logos had faded into ghost-like smudges. There was a flashlight, long dead, and a child's drawing taped to the far wall, crayons pressed into paper with frantic, uneven lines. It was a prison designed not just to contain, but to erase. And in that space, Time seemed to collapse in on itself, trapping the stifled sobs and muffled screams that had never reached the surface. The official report said Matthew Clark hadn't died the day he disappeared. He had lived, trapped and voiceless, for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. The revelation hit the town like a second death. Parents who once let their children roam freely now clutched them tighter. Neighbors who had waved to Hart as he mowed his lawn now saw him in nightmares. There were calls for apologies, investigations into why no one had dug deeper back then, why whispers of suspicion had never grown into action. But none of it mattered to Claire Clark, whose grief now swelled into something more monstrous than before. Knowing her son had breathed the same air as her for days after he vanished, knowing he may have cried out in the night just blocks away. These were truths that didn't heal. They blistered. The room below wasn't just a hidden cell. It was a confession etched in drywall and silence, a testament to how evil can live comfortably beneath our feet when no one dares to look down. Tucked in the back of a warped desk drawer, behind rusted nails and an old cassette tape, they found the journal, leather-bound, its cover brittle with age and stained with something dark and unspoken. It was Eldon Hart's, no doubt. His cramped handwriting covered every page in uneven lines that danced between lucid thought and manic scrawl, like a mind unraveling in slow motion. Some entries were mundane, lists of groceries, cryptic numbers, sketches of locks and hinges, but others made the blood run cold. He wrote of a boy who wouldn't listen, of how the silence became necessary, and of nights where the floor trembled with the weight of guilt. There was an entry dated 3 days after Matthew disappeared that simply read, "Still crying. Still watching the light." Another, weeks later. Quiet was finally achieved. Peace, at last. The words weren't a confession in the legal sense, no clear admission, no timeline, but they echoed with the kind of truth that doesn't need punctuation. It was enough. Enough for the detectives to close the file, enough for the press to run headlines that left no room for doubt, enough for Claire Clark to weep, holding pages she wished had never been written. Eldon Hart had poured his madness into that book with the cold detachment of someone who saw the world not as a community, but as a series of obstacles to his control. The journal, now tagged and sealed in an evidence bag, was read aloud in courtrooms and newsrooms alike, each word carving a deeper wound into the collective psyche of a town that once thought monsters looked different. It became the closest thing they'd ever get to a confession, ink in place of remorse, metaphors in place of apology. And in those pages, Matthew Clark lived again, not as a boy on a missing poster, but as a ghost whispering through the mad ramblings of a man who had buried more than just bones beneath his home. The grief that had simmered beneath Ashridge's surface for 25 years erupted into fury the moment the full truth was revealed. Candlelight vigils turned into town hall meetings packed with tearful parents, angry residents, and shaken lawmakers who struggled to find words in the face of such long-buried horror. Claire Clark, once the quiet figure in the corner of community events, now stood at the center of a movement. Signs reading "Never Again" and "Justice for Matthew" filled the streets. People who had once waved politely at Eldon Hart now cursed his name, demanding to know how he was ever allowed to live among them unquestioned. In response, city officials scrambled to propose new regulations, mandatory background checks for anyone employed in child-adjacent jobs, a permanent task force for cold cases, and a policy ensuring that missing child investigations would remain active, not shelved into bureaucratic limbo. The Hart House, already the subject of local ghost stories and whispered speculation, was cordoned off with bright orange fencing. The word "condemned" was spray-painted in blood red across its front door by an anonymous hand, and no one bothered to clean it. Residents called for its destruction, not just out of safety, but as a symbolic purge, a way to remove the stain that had haunted their neighborhood for so long. Children were kept closer, locks double-checked, and parents began to speak more openly to their kids about the dangers that don't always wear strangers' faces. What was once a town that had lulled itself into believing such things could never happen here was now wide awake, raw and wounded, but no longer willing to whisper. The foundation that once held Eldon Hart's house would soon be rubble, but the rage it unearthed wouldn't fade so easily. Ashridge wasn't just grieving Matthew Clark, they were grieving the illusion that they had ever truly known who lived next door. The day of Matthew Clark's funeral arrived with skies the color of bruised cotton, thick with clouds, but no rain, as if the heavens themselves held their breath. It wasn't a large affair, but it was intimate, solemn, and achingly overdue. There were no caskets or polished hearses, just a small wooden box and a framed photograph of a boy forever frozen at 10, smiling with a chipped tooth and dirt on his chin. Claire Clark stood at the edge of the crowd, like a shadow wrapped in black lace, her body still but her hands trembling as she clutched the stem of a single white lily. 25 years after she lost him, she finally got to say goodbye. The ground where Eldon Hart's house once stood had been cleared, leveled, salted, and blessed, and in its place rose a new beginning, Matthew's Grove. A small park with a stone bench, a bronze plaque etched with his name, and a lone sapling at its center, planted by Claire's own shaking hands. It wasn't justice, not really. Nothing could rewrite what had been done, but it was something real, something alive. Children now played where Matthew had once been buried in silence, their laughter mixing with the wind like a lullaby for a boy who never got to grow up. Local schools began to teach his story, not to frighten, but to remind. Remind the town that monsters sometimes wear neighbors' clothes. Remind them that a mother's love can outlive even the worst kind of silence. And remind them that even when a voice is stolen, a name can still be remembered. As Claire sat beneath the tree that now held her son's name, eyes closed, hand pressed to the soil, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The world was finally listening,